Tallis 2020 was going to be this beautiful coming together of performance and academia. Talking Tallis is our way of bringing you golden nuggets of what to expect next year in our conference, together with an exclusive preview of the CD ORA Singers is launching this summer. I could not be prouder of my association with ORA Singers and Suzi Digby. Thomas Tallis, 16th century composer who managed to live and survive and compose across the reigns of 4 Tudor monarchs, from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, adapting his musical compositional style accordingly across the Reformations. There's just so much to say when one discusses Tallis. Tonight is a collaboration between various parties, and I cannot thank everyone enough. From our own ORA team of conference conveners, including myself, Mark Tatlow, and Victoria Cooper, together with our early modern period specialist, Dr. Janet Dickinson, as well as John Milsom, Professor John Milsom, who's been our honorary academic advisor throughout all of this. And of course, Peter Gritton, who's going to provide a paper, who's reading a paper on the beauty and proportion in Tallis' Spem and alium. Kerry McCarthy, whose new book is coming out this summer, and who's also taken some questions with a Q&A at the end. So as you can see, it's a wonderful collaboration between many, many people. And of course, it could not have been done without the ORA team, Matthew Beale and Natalie Watson. Apart from that, my biggest thanks probably have to go to the always inspiring Suzi Digby and Sir James MacMillan for his extraordinary work, Vidi, Aquam, a reflection on Tallis' Spem and alium for 40 voices, which is just beyond words. Thank you all.
Thanks for joining us online. This time next year, I'll be with all of you at the festival in Oxford. For now, I'm still here in Oregon. But it's great to be part of this project and just to have the chance to work with such an amazing piece of music. So for now, I'll just say a few things about Tallis' 40-part motet, Spem and alium. I've got about 10 or 15 minutes, so I'd like to look at it in a few different ways. First of all, how is it put together? What does Tallis do with his 40 voices? Second, what did people think of it when it was first composed? What did they make of it at the time? And third, what are some things that Tallis does to make this such an attractive piece of music? So first, how is Spem and alium put together? And if you're interested in that question, you have a real treat to look forward to at the conference, the festival next year. My colleague John Milsom is going to be there, and he is absolutely brilliant at musical analysis, and he's going to go into the deep structure of the whole thing. But for now, I just want to give a little introduction. So this is easily the most monumental piece of music to come out of the whole English Renaissance. No other Tudor composer ever wrote anything on this kind of scale. Tallis himself certainly never wrote anything else for 40 parts. So how does he set up his 40 parts? He sets them up in groups of 5. Well, the basic layout for an English choir in the 16th century was 5 parts. And if you were a very important choir, like the Chapel Royal, one of the cathedrals, or the colleges, you had a 5-part group on each side, so a total of 10 parts. And you can still see that arrangement in the choir stalls of big churches where they sing from both sides. So in Tallis' day, if you were in a really cushy arrangement, you had 10 voices to work with. Spem and alium is on such a huge scale that a 10-voice group like that is just one little building block in a much bigger structure. So Tallis has got his 40 voices. How does he use them? There are a few basic approaches he takes. One approach is what we hear at the very beginning of the piece, which is to bring the voices in one by one and 2 by 2, just like you would in a more normal sort of situation. In fact, when the first 2 voices start their little opening duet, there's really no hint that this is going to be anything other than a normal Renaissance motet. Well, other than the fact that there are 38 other people standing there on stage, starting to concentrate. And if they don't have full scores in front of them, they're starting to count. I've been there, I've done the counting. I think I was alto choir 5, but there's something extraordinary about being inside this music, especially as it's starting to build up. The voices are coming in by ones and twos. The music is physically getting closer to you. It's like this unstoppable wave that's coming towards you. And then it makes contact, and then you're submerged. Then you're inside. So that's one technique that Tallis uses to bring the voices in gradually. And he does that beginning with voice 1, going to voice 40. And then later in the piece, he starts with voice 40 and goes back to voice 1. So he takes it in both directions. And this particular project, you might have seen the choir standing in a circle. So in this case, it's clockwise and counterclockwise around the space. Another technique that Tallis uses is to bring the voices in fairly large groups. And usually these are the groups of 10 that we talked about a couple minutes ago, these sort of building blocks. So here's an example of what it sounds like with these various blocks of 10 voices singing back and forth with each other in a kind of dialogue. And then finally, another thing you can do with 40 voices is to bring them all in at once. You don't want to do that too often, but it's a very effective thing to do when you choose to. So that's a basic overview of how Spem and alium is put together. And the next question is, what on earth did people think of this 40-part motet when they first heard it? And we're lucky to have a story about that. A lot of pieces by Tallis, I found myself wishing, oh, if we only had a story about its origins. This particular one, we're lucky enough to have a story. And it was told by a student in London, a law student, in the year 1611, so a generation after Tallis died. Our student informant heard this story, and he wrote it down in a notebook he kept. He had a little notebook where he wrote down all the anecdotes and all the jokes and all the sort of tales that he heard in his daily life. And this is one of them. So to sum it up briefly, our student says that in the time of Queen Elizabeth, there was a piece of 30 parts, a 30-part song that was written by an unnamed Italian. He never actually tells us who the Italian is. But this 30-part music was circulating in England. And a certain English nobleman, again, he's not named in the story, wanted to see if an English composer could do even better. So he had someone talk with Tallis and find out if he was willing to try. And Tallis wrote a piece in 40 parts, which, I quote, so far surpassed the other, that when the patron heard it sung, he spontaneously took off the gold chain from around his neck, which would have been a vastly expensive object, and put the gold chain around Tallis's neck. So that's the story. I've looked at Tallis's will, and the will of his wife as well, other family members, and that there are no gold chains in there. So we can be a little skeptical about the details. I don't know, maybe he sold it to buy more music paper. But there also wasn't any 30-part music circulating in Elizabethan England as far as we know. There definitely was some 40-part music circulating by the Italian composer Alessandro Striggio, who may have been the impetus for this new 40-part motet. But in any case, what interests me about this story is that Tallis's 40-part motet was so far surpassing its model, so much better, that the person who commissioned it was clearly stunned when he heard it sung. It's not just a big showpiece that makes lots of noise with lots of musicians. It's exceptionally good music in its own right. Everything about it just works. And people appreciated this. In fact, they revived the whole piece for a big state event for the investiture of the Prince of Wales in 1610. And our storytelling law student talks about that too. They made copies of it, and they preserved it as a sort of monument. And already by the 17th century, Tallis's Spem and Alium had become a sort of part of English musical folklore. There's another very early story about the harpsichordist and composer John Bull, who was famous or maybe notorious for all sorts of reasons. But John Bull allegedly spent a few hours in a locked room with a copy of Spem and Alium, and he came out of the room with 40 more parts he had added to it. And when his colleagues saw this new 80-part motet, he told John Bull, "You must be in league with the devil." I personally find that story a bit harder to believe, but whether or not you believe the actual story, what it tells us is that Spem and Alium already had a reputation as this sort of Mount Everest of English choral music. In some ways it still is. So finally, the last thing I want to think about, what are some things that Tallis does to make this such a great piece of music? One thing is that he's not afraid to use moments of absolute silence. And silence is also a very important form of music. In some ways, the most impressive thing you can do with 40 voices is to suddenly have them all stop singing at once. Tallis does that a few times at very crucial points. By this stage in his life, he had lots of practice composing silence. Now, his earliest works from before the Reformation are basically a kind of wall-to-wall glorious sound. But when he started writing church music in English, he started writing silences as well. He'd put in these little pauses all the time, these little breaks in the music, almost like a sort of natural punctuation in the English text, as if he were speaking like we are now. He came back to this same idea when he wrote Spem and Alium, but now he wasn't using it for little English anthems and services and psalms. He was using it on the grandest possible scale. And when there are 40 parts singing, yes, it's all very impressive. But when they all suddenly stop, and you're just left with their resonance in this completely blank space, that's breathtaking. And Tallis isn't afraid to do that. Now, another thing he isn't afraid to do is to make unexpected chord changes, to write unexpected harmonies. And that's something he experiments with in other works, but he really gets a stunning effect from it here. And there's a place I'm thinking of in particular, right near the end of Spem and Alium, where he writes a completely unexpected chord change. C major to A major, out of the blue, zero preparation. You're allowed to do that if you're Schubert or Gesualdo or something, but we don't necessarily think of Tallis doing things like that. He did sometimes. And one thing that makes it so effective here is that he uses one of his silences. Just before we get that wonderful A major chord out of nowhere, there's that moment of silence. It's one of the places where there's a rest in all 40 parts. And when the voices come out of silence onto that new chord, what's the word they sing? They sing the word respice, which means look, consider, pay attention, really. That's what Tallis is telling us to do with that sound. Look. Listen. So I'll play that bit for you, just to show you what it sounds like, and then we can have some questions and answers. All right, I'm back with some questions from the audience. So here's the first question. Has Spem been celebrated and performed through the centuries, or was it only relatively recently rediscovered? So there's a note on one of the 17th century manuscripts of Spem and Alium, and the note says, "The song of 40 parts, often seen but seldom sung." And it went through a couple of centuries when it really was seldom sung. if at all. And it was really revived only in the 19th century when people started to revive early music. And the Madrigal Society in London did what I guess you could call the modern premiere in 1836. And in fact, they had all the singers sign their names on the full score just to prove that they'd done it. And they did it a few more times in the 19th century. The reviews were a bit mixed. In fact, I'll give you just a few quotes from those reviews. One review said, "Fewer mistakes occurred than could have been expected." Another review, this one is from The Spectator, said that this music was the mistake of a barbarous age. I like that one. Another one said it was ingenious, if not particularly useful. And then a fourth one said it was about as interesting or valuable as a table made of 1,000,000 pieces of wood, and so on. But you can find all these reviews in a wonderful book by Suzanne Cole on the revival of Tallis's music in the Victorian era. And the book is called Thomas Tallis and His Music in Victorian England. Look it up, Suzanne Cole, if you're interested in the early music movement or if you're just interested in snarky music journalism. It's a great read. Now, the next question has to do with the stories that I was telling about Spem and alium, about Tallis being given a priceless piece of gold jewelry for it, or one of his colleagues trying to add 40 more parts to it. And this is the question: what is true and what is fiction, as far as we are able to tell from the distance of the 20th century? People have always liked stories about music, especially stories about premieres. Think of the story about The Rite of Spring, how allegedly the audience started rioting when it was first performed. And these stories really take on a life of their own, usually semi-fictionalized. Why is that? Because these premieres are moments of change. These are moments when something new is happening. And it's hard to tell how much of the detail is really true in these stories about Tallis's music. But what's clear is that something new really is happening. This music itself was clearly something new, and not just because it had lots of parts. For example, Spem and alium is the oldest piece of English music with a thorough bass part, what you might call a basso continuo part. And the oldest manuscript, in fact, calls it just that, the Song of 40 Parts by Mr. Thomas Tallis, with a thorough bass. And this seems to imply that Tallis himself made this bass part as a sort of structural ingredient in the whole thing. In any case, he was obviously composing from the bass upwards on some level. You have this harmonic structure, and then you build up the detail from these large harmonic blocks. That was a very progressive way to compose in the late 16th century. It was a very modern way. This is something that his fashionable Italian colleagues were doing. He knew about it, and he was doing it too. So one more question from the audience, which is, what can Spem mean to us today? In some ways, that's really a question for the 40 singers who've just recorded it. I wish they could be here. Obviously, they wouldn't all fit in this room. But there's something special about polyphonic music like this, because it's a type of art that can only be created in groups and by groups. It's quite unlike so many of the other arts of the Renaissance, like painting and sculpture and poetry and preaching, which can be created by a sort of solitary genius working in isolation. Choral music is different because it requires a community, and that was true in Tallis's day, and it's true right now. Of course, if you've heard Peter Gritton's wonderful talk in this series, he's the exception that proves the rule because he multi-tracked the whole 40-part motet in 40 voices, and it sounds really, really good. But this music is something that normally we recreate together, and we experience together in this very immediate way. Whether we're performing it, whether we're conducting it, whether we're listening to it. And what we get from this is a kind of immediacy. We're right there with Tallis in his world. Even though he lived in a fairly different world, I have to remind myself sometimes that he composed this piece without notation software. He did this without electric light. He did this even without caffeine, which I think is fairly impressive. But he created this incredible, complex microcosm of sound, and we can go visit him there. And we can go visit him there together, which is really the beauty of it. So thank you for all your great questions, and I look forward so much to seeing you all at the festival next year.
We've just heard the opening of Sir James MacMillan's extraordinary 40-part reflection of Spem and Alium, Vidi, Aquam, which will be released on Harmonia Mundi on the 21st of August. And I'm thrilled to have Sir James with us here today to ask him some questions about this great piece. Hi, Jimmy.
Hello there. It's great to be with you.
Great to be with you too. So I've been thinking a lot about the recording session that we had of your piece last year and how it felt. It was probably the most thrilling moment of my entire career. I think that it really felt like history in the making recording that piece, and I'm not overstating that. In fact, it has been described since as a newborn spirit rising from the body of Spem. And what's so remarkable for me is that you've used the same formal structure as Tallis's Spem and Alium. You've created something so original. So can you talk a little bit about how that propelled you to writing the work?
Yes. Well, it was important to me that there was a kind of structure, and the fact that the piece is, in a sense, at least structurally, architecturally, rooted in the experience of the Tallis Spem and Alium. It has 40 parts, of course. It's devised in a similar way of 8 choirs of 5 voices, although the voices are very different in tessitura and so on compared to the Tallis. But I decided to almost make a kind of mirror image of the Tallis in the sense of how it moves around the circle, choir to choir, as a kind of homage to the original, but also as a way of rooting myself psychologically in that tradition. And there was no point in trying to hide the fact that it is a work that is meant to be a reflection of the original. And there are some similarities, I suppose, in some of the counterpoint and so on, but very soon after the first few bars, the first few choral entries, the music does go in a very different direction and into very different territory. It's music of the 21st century. But to find a rootedness in the Tallis was very important to me to begin with.
Is it possible for you then to sum up this extraordinary ability you have to create something really original out of the Renaissance language and formal structures? What are some of the devices you've used?
Yes, well, I think that composers in our own time can learn a lot from looking at the great contrapuntal masters of the past. Not just Tallis, but also Bach even, and Palestrina and William Byrd. And actually, when you look at it, a traditional university style of education, music education, involved the very close study of those composers. It might be quite old-fashioned now, but it was a perfect grounding for me as a composer to look at how Bach two-part inventions worked, how he worked fugal expositions, how species counterpoint worked at the hands of the master Palestrina, and then to try to vary the style and look at the English versions of that. And I suppose all those exercises, those student exercises that we all did as music students, when we were young, they might have been regarded as simply and merely an exercise by many, and perhaps a bit tedious for some people who didn't see where it was leading. But I think for a composer like me, it was absolutely vital. Not that I wanted to write pastiche of the original forms in later life, but it's because these composers taught or teach a very profound lesson about how composers today can handle complexity in their music. And with Tallis and Byrd and Palestrina, of course, it was line against line, melody against melody. It can still be that. But for us today, there are other concepts that work in complexity, not just line against line, but sometimes rhythm against rhythm. tonality against tonality and how you merge those tonalities. So there's profound and archetypal lessons that composers can learn from the deep past. Having said all that, though, there's something about that style that has always lived with me, and I've tried to find a place for it in my own choral writing. Not as pastiche, but certainly using the Bird and Tallis and Palestrina style of counterpoint as a kind of model, as a beginning point. And the question, can you write a polyphony for the 21st century? And I think you can, but there is no point in trying to hide the importance of the deep past. And so with a work like this, my Vidi Aquam, I think you can hear the deep past, certainly as it begins. You can hear there are references and allusions being made to this 16th and 17th century. But there are allusions that the composer, the living composer of the 21st century can build on to move into new territory.
What are the challenges of writing in 40 parts? Because we're all aware that since, in fact, even before Tallis wrote Spem and Alium, there have been many attempts to write 40-part vocal pieces. And in my view, yours is the first one that really stands up to the brilliance of the Tallis. So how intimidating was this commission? And what are the technical and musical challenges of writing in 40 separate parts?
Yes, well, initially the challenges were very intimidating, and I know this has been in discussion with ORA for many years, but I remember the very first discussions that I had about it, and I just hope that you would all forget about the 40-part bit. That was my initial reaction, because it was very daunting. But the more I lived with the concept, the more I had to think about it. Yes, of course, the modern composer especially is used to dealing with complexity. It tends to be an instrumental complexity, though. And sometimes that richness of instrumental texture for the modern composer can sometimes imply chaos and confusion in a score. And I've never really been attracted to that aspect of modernity. I think if you are going to have complexity in music, whether it's instrumental or vocal, you need to hear that there is line against line, voice against voice, and that each voice is doing something unique. And in that sense, the Tallis was a marvellous model because you are aware of the 40 parts. But your amazing thing is that he doesn't use 40 parts all the time, perhaps in the way that a modern composer might. So in a sense, that was the first lesson. And in a sense, that's I decided to follow Tallis. At the very beginning, there's just one voice, then there's two, then there's three, and gradually it builds. And very tentative that it moves out of 4 and 5 parts to 10 parts. And then at certain structural moments, it suddenly blossoms into 40 parts. The problem is sometimes if you create a very dense harmonic texture, you can lose the sense of where the core of the harmony is. And so for me, it was very important that the modality of the music exerted its presence all the time. Even in the kind of smudgy moments where my style moves into a kind of impressionistic haze, you're still aware of what the 1 or 2 modes are that are kind of merging and meshing together. So that simplicity of approach was important. And I got into a way of working. What originally had been terrifying for me, the 40-part division, became something that I really enjoyed. I enjoyed getting up in the morning and coming to the desk every day, and it did feel like an intellectual exercise, but an enjoyable one. It felt, I've said it before, it felt like knitting. Making some sort of patchwork out of wool or something, or doing a crossword, and I felt my mind was being not just inspired but motivated, having to deal with it with such a degree of complexity.
That is absolutely fascinating. And what also is fascinating is your choice of text.
Mm-hmm.
So if you could just explain your impulse for your choice of text from the Spem and alium text.
Well, I looked at the complete Spem and alium text. I wanted to have a look at it and see, there's not a lot of text there at all, just a few phrases. And I suppose that was like a light going on. I didn't need a lot of text. I needed something quite compliant and condensed in the way that the Spem and alium text was. I've spent my whole life dealing with liturgical texts in English and Latin, I suppose. So the one that came immediately to mind is the Vidi Aquam text, which is from the Easter liturgy. It's a similar length, and I could see it being broken down into a similar phraseology. It was a text and an imagery that I was very at home with. I could see the possibility of creating a sense of that Easter joy out of the Vidi Aquam text, and a sense of the waters bursting their banks and filling the soul with a kind of Easter joy. So there was a kind of pictorialism that I thought was inherent in the Vidi Aquam text. That as I say, it was small enough and limited enough to be able to deal with it in a similar structural sense as to Spem and alium.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. And we're going to now hear the closing bars, which you mark sing joyfully, but I don't think there's any other way that one could sing them. So here are the closing bars of Sir James MacMillan's Vidi Aquam, to be released on Harmonia Mundi on the 21st of August. Thank you so much, Jimmy.
You're welcome.
When so many choirs are celebrating with performances and recordings of Thomas Tallis's Spem in alium, it is a huge pleasure to be speaking to you here about this masterpiece, arguably one of the greatest composing achievements, at a time when ORA is about to release its excellent recording, along with Sir James MacMillan's brand new 40-part Vidi Aquam. I've had a fascination with Spem in alium for probably over 40 years, since my chorister days at Salisbury Cathedral. We combined with the choirs of Chichester and Winchester in the Southern Cathedrals Festival. The layout of the choirs intrigued me even in those days, and has left a visual memory as strong as the oral one. We spread out in the crossing, underneath that amazing spire, and then down the nave, surrounding the captive audience. Years later, having the opportunity to conduct Spem in alium in St John Smith Square, using the balconies for performers, projecting down to the audience below. And then Leeds Castle, that was an interesting one, conducting 40 singers in the round, all under the rather steely stare of Henry VIII. As a further extension to getting to know the piece, I managed to record all 40 parts myself quite recently, down a minor third, as you can hear. Other than the exquisite extract at the beginning of this short film, which was from ORA's new album, I have used my recording here as illustrations. Several years ago, in perusing and preparing the score before conducting, I decided to typeset the whole piece. On a whim, I decided to organise the layout of the score in a regular fashion, really to save paper initially. With a total bar count of 138 bars, the motet was divisible by 6, so I thought, let's divide it up into 6 double-sided spreads, seeing 23 bars at a time. What intrigued me was that the epic 40-part tutti features appeared to be centralised on the pages in my layout. While I had no answers from this observation, it spurred me on to take the motet apart through analysis. My composer's brain was whirring. I was witnessing something extremely beautiful coming into focus, but I needed to go to the next level of precision over Spem and alium's proportions. I'd read about how relevant Pythagoras' theories were in the Renaissance in terms of architectural proportion, so I thought I would apply Pythagoras to what I felt was the rather palatial proportions of Spem and alium. But at the start, there were also some rather small details popping out at me. One voice in bar 1, but by bar 5 there are 5 voices. Then suspended over the 10th bar line, the 10th entry. Using the principle of doubling, i.e. from 5 to 10 and then 10 to 20 and 20 to 40, we can observe Tallis holding back the 20th entry for a couple of bars, seen plainly in the 16th voice, which finally is allowed to come in, as it does so suspended over the 20th bar line. This looked to me very much like Tallis was consciously imbuing his work with numerical significance. Everyone who knows this piece knows that Tallis waits until bar 40 before unleashing all the parts together. Bar 40, the most talked about moment in Spem and alium, at the climax of the setting of line 2, Praeter inter, is here centred on my 4th page. But at the start of the page is the impactful chordal entry by parts 11 to 20, more similar to the effect of bar 40 than any of the contrapuntal music that precedes it. Its impact is a game changer in terms of mood. In fact, bar 35 marks the quarter-way point in the whole motet. As the sounds of the 40-part tutti fade in bar 46, we have actually reached 1/3 of the way through. The entry of many voices in bar 69 surged towards the complete tutti in bar 70 with the words of line 4, et omnia, and serves as the Pythagorean 1-to-1 central hinge. However, just as the 40-part tutti in bar 40 had been preceded by a reduced forces entry 5 bars earlier in bar 35, Tallis does the same here. Why does Tallis gently introduce et omnia 5 bars earlier? It's what I did next that gave me the next level of insight. I put the notation into a panorama spread so I could see the whole motet in one picture, and in so doing the overall proportions became so much clearer. Tallis sets 6 lines of text overall. We can observe that between bars 23 and 27 he dovetails line 1, Spem in alium, and line 2, Praeter inter. Note that this is a 5-bar dovetail. Then between bars 44 and 48 he dovetails Praeter inter with line 3, Qui irasceris, another 5-bar overlap. So it seems that Tallis allows himself 5 bars before a new section establishes itself. Let's now revisit bar 65, with the counterpoint of line 3, Qui irasceris, having run its course after 21 bars, meandering up the voice parts. Tallis then occupies the 5 bars before halfway with the text of line 4, et omnia, preparing us subtly for a dramatic change in mood with the epic tutti at the halfway hinge. The practical precision, beauty of proportion, and emotive power in Spem in alium is staggering. Inside this central tutti is one of the most potent collective breaths in Western music, at In Tribulatione, at bar 74. The music is becoming increasingly emotionally racked. But then, out of the next 40-part tutti in bars 86 to 87 at Dimitis, emerges the joyous Italianate antiphony of the Domine Deus section that follows. There's a strong sense that Tallis is musically nodding towards Rome, a Catholic gesture that would have passed the Protestant enforcers by. Often the most complex of puzzles begins with a straightforward conceptual plan. With my composer's hat on, I'm certain that Tallis would have needed a diagrammatic plan to keep tabs on his construction. Domine Deus starts in bar 87, that's 17 bars after the halfway mark in bar 70. The constant 40-part polyphony of the final Respise in bar 122 lasts for 17 bars before coming to its amazing conclusion in bar 138. But 17 bars of music in this motet equates to an eighth of the overall length. So by adding these two sets of 17 bars together gives us 1/8 plus 1/8 equals 1/4. Therefore, Domine Deus and the first beautiful Respise section combine to form a triptych-like panel lasting 1/4 of the motet. On a diagrammatic plan, this would have been extremely symbolic, placing the description of God, Domine Deus, Creator Celi et Terrae, Lord God, Creator of heaven and earth, in this central panel. I'll leave you with a bit of a teaser. In the Elizabethan era, there was quite a fascination with puzzles, riddles and secret codes. In 1567, around the same time as Stricho came to England, Archbishop Parker brought out a new rhyming psalter in English. He was about the same age as Tallis, in his 60s, this being his last, if not main, contribution to his people. As a preface to Psalm 119, Parker composed a sonnet-like poem which concealed his name, Matthäus Parkerus, each letter being the first letter of a line. This is an excellent example of an acrostic puzzle, and in this context could be interpreted as a playful but modest way of Parker signing off his psalter, for at no other point in the publication does he put his name. Tallis contributed 8 contrasting tunes harmonised in 4 parts, to which all 150 psalms could be sung. He would most likely have been aware of Parker's acrostic poem, so if we return to the panorama view, there is something suggestively graphological to the shapes we have just explored. In intellectually playful mood, could it be that Tallis is signing off his greatest musical achievement, the signature to be seen and heard only by God? This will be analysed in full in a subsequent presentation. By analysing Tallis's iconic masterpiece, there's a sense that we can begin to know something of his character, his strength of religious belief, his compositional brilliance through extraordinary powers of organisation and proportion. And that is not even going anywhere near his expressive command of counterpoint, his unique treatment of harmony and dissonance, and his holistic dramatic drive through perfectly considered choices of modal key areas. This reportedly mild and quiet man parades all his musical wares in Spem and Alium, sating us musically and emotionally, all to the glory of his all-seeing God.